Minato Namikaze is one of the strongest shinobi in the history of Naruto. From his legendary rasengan to his masterful use of teleportation and sealing techniques, Minato's abilities are borderline mythical in the Naruto universe. But these days, in the power scaling community, it seems there's a new wave attempting to lowball Minato to abysmal levels. So, in this video, my goal is to set the record straight and go over the most fair scaling for the Yellow Flash at each point in his shinobi journey, with evidence to back up my claims. In other words, today we'll be exploring and breaking down why Minato is underrated. Minato has been a prodigy, likely since he popped out of the womb. I mean, we get statements all throughout the series, from Jiraiya and Tsunade to chapter synopsis statements, that claim Minato had unparalleled talent, or that everyone paled in comparison to him. But the question is, when did this seemingly divine talent begin to bear its face? Well, unlike some others like Kakashi, Itachi, or Shisui, Minato doesn't really have any direct showings or statements about his power or skill until he's about 10 to 12 years old, when he became a Chunin. At this point in Minato's life, we know two things. Number one, Minato has the highest written exam scores in Konoha's history, and number two, he was able to save Kushina from some random cloud shinobi. What these two things do for his scaling is a bit ambiguous, as A, some other prodigies like Kakashi took the Chunin exams at a much earlier age, so the written exam scores may not even be that impressive of a feat, and B, we have no idea what rank those cloud shinobi were. You could make an argument that had someone like Kakashi not taken the exams at 6 and rather taken them at 10 like Minato, he may have achieved better scores. We just don't know. And if the cloud shinobi are all Jonin and Minato beat them up, the scaling assertions from that for Minato would be absurdly high. Whereas if they're all Chunin and he just distracted them, ran in and stole Kushina back, then we really don't get any scaling assertions from that. So, for this section, I think it's most fair to leave you with a high-end interpretation and a low-end interpretation. On the high end, if you believe that he beat up 3 Jonin to save Kushina, he'd be at bare minimum mid to high Jonin level, with assertions for peak Jonin or even low Kage, because to handle, Jonin like that, depending on where they rank, you gotta be pretty strong. On the other hand, if you think they're all Chunin and he just distracted them, stole Kushina, and ran away, we can only safely get him to maybe that Chunin tier. I personally think it's probably somewhere in between, like they probably are Chunin and he just beat them up and then stole her, but there's just not enough evidence for us to firmly place him anywhere based on this, scaling-wise. Teen Minato, specifically from the one-shot manga, is also a bit weird to scale, but not nearly as ambiguous. In terms of this Minato, who's probably 14, he's an animal. And the reason why we know he's about 14 is because he's 10 years older than Kakashi, and Kakashi is seen in the one-shot manga alongside Guy, both of whom are missing their ninja headbands. This means that they have certainly enrolled in the academy as they met at registration, but they haven't graduated. Since Kakashi becomes a genin at 5, we know with a fair amount of certainty that Minato must be no older than 14 here. Some have argued 13, but I sincerely doubt that this is a 3-year-old Kakashi here, because that would mean that he stayed in the academy for 2 years, which makes no sense considering the fact that he became a Chunin 1 year after graduating from the academy, and we get direct statements saying that because it was wartime, they did accelerate the academy graduation to try to get them out in training with an actual Jonin leader, because they needed soldiers on the battlefield. That said, as I pointed out earlier, this Minato is an absolute unit. At this point, Minato has already got the FTG in his arsenal, although he still has to use hand signs while using it, and he even invents an A-rank jutsu in the rasengan in 24 hours, so saying he's a prodigy is a massive understatement. I think this is actually the point in time that Jiraiya is likely referring to when talking about him being a once-in-a-generation talent and that everyone pales in comparison to him in that light. But that's not all. In the one-shot manga, he also gets 2 very important lines of scaling that are hotly contested in the power scaling community. The first is a statement from Kurama, who, upon seeing Minato suppress Kushina's seal and rewrite it with his own style, claims that Minato is of a similar caliber of shinobi to Hashirama. Now, obviously, if you take this at face value, this statement is insane. However, I do think that there is some important context to point out when going over this particular statement. First, a lot of people say that this is in reference to sealing, but that's probably not true since Hashirama literally has to wait for the sealing corps to come seal Madara during the war arc. So, if it's not in reference to sealing, then what is it in reference to? Well, I think it's probably talent or skill. Kurama makes this statement because despite not being an Uzumaki, Minato is capable of rewriting the tetragram seal in his own style. Rewriting a seal is less of a power feat and more of a skill or talent feat, especially if, as Kurama points out, the person doing it doesn't come from a clan specifically known for that ability. So, this statement lines up perfectly with his lore of being an unparalleled talent, but shouldn't make us ignore the war arc scaling and catapult him to that Hashirama tier in terms of power. But I did say that there are two lines of scaling, and this next one is honestly the one that's most contentious. Minato potentially matching a Kurama Bijudama. So here's what I'll say out the gate. There is no way to say one way or another whether or not this Rasengan scales to a full power Kurama Biju Bomb, as both of them are unquantifiably nerfed. But I think digging into the context of what specific nerfs they're facing at that specific moment in time is super important when evaluating this scene. First, let's go over Kurama's quote-unquote nerfs. He basically has two here. One is the fact that he is being restrained by Kushina's chains, which are known to suppress chakra. And two, the Biju Bomb is still forming, as we can see the chakra still being gathered. This would indicate that the Biju Bomb and Kurama himself are not at full power here. But I do think that Minato's nerfs are definitely more severe. Not only is Minato weaker in Kushina's mental scape, as pointed out by B, but he also has just created that Rasengan that day, which he doesn't fully master for another 4 years. He's fatigued from training to invent the said Rasengan. I mean, when we see him training, like right before this, there's all kinds of just explosion marks all over the ground. So he's done this several times that day alone. And this isn't even considering the fact that he has, a gaping hole in his torso from Kurama's arm. So think about that, but then also think about the fact that Kurama's chakra, specifically in the level 2 state, is also stated to work like a poison, which caused Sakura to not be able to move properly for a good amount of time after barely being scratched by it. So I think it's fairly obvious that having a massive hole in your chest, poison coursing through your veins, and being in a state where you're fatigued and in a mental scape that makes you naturally weaker, while using an ability that you just created and haven't even mastered yet, should mean that he is significantly weaker here than he would normally be. That said, the fact that Minato must have won this clash, otherwise Kurama would have just taken over Kushina fully, on top of the fact that this is one Rasengan as opposed to the 52 Rasengans that Naruto needed in order to just push back one half of Kurama, with stronger chains restraining Kurama than the ones that Kushina used with Minato, since, the chains get stronger as the user of the chains gets older. And when you consider the fact that Naruto couldn't take down this one half of Kurama while using Sage Mode, I mean, this is ludicrous. So, for me personally, when you consider all of the factors that I just outlined, and the fact that he's either a Jonin here or becomes a Jonin soon, since he's Kakashi's Jonin team leader at 15, I think it's fair to scale him at bare minimum firmly in the Kage tier of combatant. Even if you do lowball the Kurama feat to its absolute bottom tier of scaling, that Bijudama is more than likely more powerful than the one that Four Tails Naruto fired at Orochimaru, as even though it's not fully formed, it is significantly larger, and it's from a full power Nine Tails. I mean, remember that Naruto only had half of Kurama sealed inside of him, and whenever he fired this Bijudama at Orochimaru, Orochimaru said that this thing could kill him. So, at bare minimum, Minato is likely packing a Sannin-slaying move in his arsenal at 14 years old. So, I know that was a lot, but I think it was important to establish the floor that we'll be working from going into the next section, because the next two sections are the ones that I really wanted to talk about. But before we do that though, if you're enjoying the video so far, or you're just, not a serial killer, make sure to like and subscribe. I would hate for the YouTube algorithm to identify you as the next potential Bundy or something. I'm just saying. Jonin Minato, as I'm describing him here, is the version of Minato we see from both the Kanami Bridge mission and the battle against A and B. Now, this version and the next version of Minato, again, are the reasons why I wanted to make the video, because I think there has been a lot of disingenuous scaling for both versions as of late. But what exactly can this Minato do? Or I guess a better question is, how has he changed from his previous version? Basically, Minato can now use the FTG with no hand signs. That's it. I mean, you can assert that Minato's physicals have probably improved since then, which is probably fair, and you could also say he's more intelligent and experienced, which I also think is fair, but other than that, we don't get a whole lot else in terms of new techniques or abilities. But let's quickly take a look at his battles that we do have and see what we can gather from them. First, we have his battle with A and B. Now, I've seen arguments that use this encounter against Minato, attempting to scale him below base B, but this makes no sense for a variety of reasons. First, B is objectively below A here because Minato calls A unruly A, which means he's already going by the title of A. It is a title, not his name, and this title is used exclusively for the strongest person in the cloud. This also means that A has already surpassed the third Raikage for a few years now, since we actually get to see that he's being called A years before this while the third Raikage was still alive. So not only should A be above B, since that title is reserved for the strongest in the cloud, he would also be above the third Raikage, which means Minato is as well. We know that he is above A for a fact, not only because of the showings, but also because this weekly chapter statement outright states that Minato has already surpassed him here. Since the third Raikage battled Gyuki, the Eight Tails, numerous times, winning most of those encounters, this would get Minato above the Eight Tails as well. With Gyuki showing relativity to halved Kurama during the war, the same halved Kurama that Naruto needed help from Kushina and B to beat in the mental scape, Minato has some really good scaling implications here, as this Naruto is stronger than he was when he fought Pain, and he couldn't bring down half of Kurama himself, even with Sage Mode. So, if Minato is above the third and fourth, who should be above Gyuki, that would mean that he is above a character in Gyuki that's relative to halved Kurama, who is above this version of Naruto even in Sage Mode. So anybody who has been arguing Sage Mode Naruto over Hokage Minato, he's not even over Jonin Minato. Something else that's definitely worth noting here is that Gyuki by himself is able to take down all of the Edo Jinchuriki, and KCM1 Naruto was having difficulty dealing with all of them at once. Now, 1v1 he would have been just fine against any of them, but as they were coordinating their attacks and everything, he was having issues with them and needed B to help him. So, Gyuki being able to handle all of them at once by himself would automatically put him above this early KCM1 Naruto as well. So, a combatant in Minato who is above this Gyuki should also be above this early KCM1 Naruto. But back to my original point. If A is the strongest in the cloud, as A is a title reserved for the strongest person in the cloud, which puts him above B and Minato is above A, how in the world can anyone argue B over Minato? They use this one scan right here. Now, some people will claim that B blitzed Minato here because he's able to knock A out of the way with his tentacle before Minato can strike him with a kunai. Nothing against the creators who use this, I mean, literally more power to you, but I think this is a super disingenuous claim. First, we have no idea where B's tentacle starts from, as even in the panel right before Minato teleports to A's back, Minato's head is covering the top section of this panel, and that's where B's tentacle could be. So B could have just anticipated this counterattack and already begun moving his tentacle for support before Minato ever even lands on the tree. Second, Minato is clearly holding back here. Instead of using his strongest attack, the rasengan, which we know he can charge up basically instantaneously, Minato uses a kunai against a lightning cloak. So either Minato, who has consistently displayed top of the verse intelligence throughout the entire series, is a total buffoon, or he just wasn't going all out. Some people will claim that it doesn't make sense for him to hold back here because they're in a war and he knows that these guys have probably killed a lot of Konoha shinobi, but the thing is, Minato is a genius and he's incredibly diplomatic, so it is in character for him to, in recognizing that this A is going to go on to become the Raikage, that he's going to have to learn to work with the Cloud in the future, and killing the future Raikage would just spark more war, but becoming friendly and developing a friendly relationship with the Raikage, as well as the Cloud's strongest Jinchuriki, is probably going to bode well in developing a time of peace moving forward. So I think with this evidence, along with the fact that he literally compliments both A and B, expressing the fact that he likes and respects them as shinobi, lends credence to the idea that he was certainly holding back here. This especially makes sense when we've already established that Minato is verifiably above A, who again is verifiably above B. That said, even a holding back Minato is capable of besting A and B simultaneously, with A being above the third Raikage. Again, that verifiably scales Minato above a stronger version of the third Raikage than we saw in the War Arc, as Edos are weaker than they are whilst alive, and they're reanimated essentially as they were from their point of death. That puts him above the Eight Tails, which potentially is relative to halved Kurama, who is massively above Sage Naruto. I also believe that the Kanami Bridge mission backs this up, since he's able to take out 50 stone shinobi by himself, having 3 Konoha shinobi throw a bunch of kunai at the enemy for himself to teleport to. One of the shinobi literally says, "Don't blink or you'll miss it," so Minato is straight up able to take down 50 shinobi in a literal blink of an eye. Now, I see people say, oh well, he couldn't do that without those guys, but the problem here is that A, Minato can use shadow clones, and B, he can use the shuriken shadow clone technique. We know this because, as my buddy Cameron has pointed out in the past, he has 6 kunai in his back pocket at the beginning of the fight with A and B, but throws out 28 of them. So genuinely, Minato is just being nice and letting those guys feel involved. He 100% could have taken those kunai and done it himself with absolutely no issues. So to conclude this section, by getting him above the 3rd and 4th Raikages, and by virtue of that both Gyuki and B, I think the absolute floor for Minato here puts him somewhere vaguely above KCM1 Naruto. So with that established, it's time to move on to our next section. There are those in the Naruto power scaling community who believe that Minato gets no stronger from his days as a Jonin in the Third War to his time as Hokage. So, to begin this section, I'd like to explore the evidence as to why that is almost certainly not true, and why and how he actually does get stronger as Hokage. Firstly, we know for a fact that Minato has evolved his FTG seal, specifically the one that he places on people, and this is something that Virtue brought up to me and I think is definitely interesting. The reason why I think it's interesting is because he actually does improve his use of the FTG from the time he's a Jonin to when he's a Hokage as well, so the evolution of this marking might indicate that improvement. We know undoubtedly that Minato has improved his FTG usage because, number one, he now has FTG Guiding Thunder, which he didn't have previously, and number two, he's now able to exit the FTG subspace with his attack already on his opponent if his opponent is marked with his FTG seal. Virtue does a great job of breaking down the FTG subspace thing, but basically, for those of you who don't know, FTG works by moving the user into a subspace or an alternate dimension, and then from that subspace relocating them to a different marker somewhere else. So previously, he was able to go into this and then come out of it with an attack prepped, but now he's able to come out of it with the attack actually landing on the opponent as he exits. For example, as a Jonin, when he teleports to A's back, he has to strike after teleporting. Same thing with the Iwa Jonin that he saves Kakashi from. Same thing with B. However, when he uses FTG against Obito during the Ninetales attack, we actually see that he enters the FTG subspace with his body in one position and then reappears in a totally different one, changing his position in such a way that his rasengan is already planted on Obito's back once he exits the FTG subspace. The anime treats this scene differently, probably for dramatic effect, but the manga is the primary canon and is actually backed up by another scene with Obito. During the War Arc, we see Minato teleport to Obito, and he slashes him as he's coming out of the subspace. Now, the attack was definitely already in motion as he exits the subspace, since he doesn't recognize that it's Obito until after the attack has already landed. This indicates that he did not teleport in front of Obito and then initiate the attack, but rather that as he came out of the subspace, the attack was already in motion. So with all of these things in consideration, he's definitely better at using FTG as Hokage than he was during the Third War against A and B and during his time at the Kanami Bridge mission. But so what? He's slightly better at FTG. Is that it? Well, not quite. My buddy Chrome brought something up to me that I think is super interesting. He presented to me the idea that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Minato likely learned Sage Mode during his time as Hokage. There are a few different pieces of evidence for this, so let's just go over them quickly. First, the timeline just works out. We know that he graduated at 10 and was in the Second War by 14, but Jiraiya doesn't have his Sage headband at this time, so it's very likely that Jiraiya hasn't taught it to Minato yet, since it's very likely that he didn't have it yet. Then the Third War occurs basically right after the Second, and Minato would have been out on the battlefield for essentially the whole time, while Jiraiya is training the Ame orphans and then is MIA. So it couldn't have been then. Since Minato stepped into the role of Hokage is almost immediately after the war ended, the most logical time for him to have learned Sage Mode is during his Hokage tenure. But I'll admit, that's not enough to prove it. Fortunately, I have two more pieces of evidence for this theory. Our second piece of evidence comes from when Fukasaku remarks that Naruto is surpassing his predecessors, specifically in Sage Mode. Since we know that even Jonin Minato scales above Sage Mode Naruto, this must be in relation to Sage Mastery. But when this comment is made, Tsunade sees images of Minato and Jiraiya. With Jiraiya in the outfit he likely would have normally wore when he learned Sage Mode, as he would have learned it after the Third War, or maybe during it, and Minato in his Hokage garb. Now, I know it's not perfect, but there is one more thing that I think ties it all together. The final point on this comes from when we actually get to see the inside of the summoning contract scroll. Underneath the panel where it shows the scroll, it specifically states that on the scroll are the names of Naruto, Jiraiya, and the fourth Hokage. Not Minato, not the Yellow Flash, the fourth Hokage. So, those 3 points come together to paint a picture that Minato learned Sage Mode as Hokage. This is important because we know that Naruto's base stats increase after learning Sage Mode, so the same should be applied here. We also know that he got access to more summoning toads, so that should also be applied to Minato here as well. So, we have a guy who is already above Gyuki and KCM Naruto, then he gets stronger, faster, and more durable, gains Sage Mode, and has access to more toad summons now. This gets Minato to some absurd levels. But let me precog the Minato haters really quick. What they're going to say is, but there's this databook statement that says A has speed not inferior to the Yellow Flash, so even though he was stronger than him back then, he's like 4th Raikage level now. And to that I say, you are blatantly incorrect. It is more likely that that statement is actually referring to Jonin Minato than it is Hokage Minato, for a few reasons. First, I actually assembled every time Minato is called Yellow Flash, and statistically, he is called the Yellow Flash more often in reference to his Jonin self than otherwise. This is pretty definitive. I mean, I have a collage on screen right now. We'll just go from left to right. On the left side, we have the Jonin Minato category. We have 2 databook statements referring to him during the Third War, which is when he would have been a Jonin. We've got 2 panels showing him being called the Yellow Flash during the Third War as well, so that's self-explanatory. And then we have 2 from Tsunade and B, both calling him the Yellow Flash, both of whom would have never seen him as Hokage, more likely than not. B would have been confined to the Hidden Cloud, as we know that A keeps him there all the time whenever he's Raikage, and then Tsunade retired from combat duties after she developed hemophobia in the Second War after watching Nawaki and Dan die. So it's very likely that neither of them have any idea what Hokage Minato is capable of. Then we have this middle section, the N/A category, where basically we have 2 databook statements that could be interpreted to go either way. The bottom one just outright says that it's the 4th Hokage's jutsu, it's referring to the Flying Raijin, but it shows pictures of him in the Third War, so with him as a Jonin, and it talks about him developing that and gaining fame for it in the Third War as well. Then the top one, I believe, should definitively go to Jonin Minato, but just for the sake of argument, since this is the statement that a lot of people use, I put it in this middle section, despite the fact that we actually get to see that this frame that we get next to that statement, where it says speed not inferior to the Yellow Flash, is a frame from a scene that we get a direct flashback to Jonin Minato in, so I would argue that that's in reference to Jonin Minato, but I'm trying to be generous here. Then on the right side, we have the times he was referenced as the Yellow Flash during his time as Hokage, or when he's directly referenced as the 4th Hokage. We have Obito calling him the Yellow Flash while he's Hokage. I will say, the last time Obito would have seen him fight would have been when he was a Jonin, so that can be argued around, but because he's a Hokage at this point in time, I think it's fair to put it there. Then we have a databook statement that talks about the Yellow Flash in reference to him as Hokage, and then I even went above and beyond and looked through all of the different novels. And in Kakashi Retsuden, we do get a statement about Minato Namikaze, the Yellow Flash, in reference to the Hokage. So, in conclusion, we have 6 statements that are definitively referring to Jonin Minato in regards to the Yellow Flash statements. We have 2 that could go either way, with I think one of those should be in that other category. And then we have 3 that are definitely in reference to him, or more likely in reference to him as Hokage. So I think that I have definitively proven that it is statistically more probable that when he's called the Yellow Flash, it is in reference to him as Jonin Minato, so the onus would be on the person proving that this databook statement is in reference to Hokage Minato, since the statistics are not on your side. I would also like to point out that it's super inconsistent to say that this is in reference to Hokage Minato, since we've already established a line of scaling getting him above Gyuki and therefore KCM Naruto, as well as the fact that A himself doesn't think that he's stronger than Minato at all at this point. We know this because he straight up states that he doesn't think that anyone could ever surpass Minato until KCM Naruto shows him his speed. So as a character who is noted to train every day, wouldn't it be odd if he's close to Minato in speed or power and doesn't think that he could ever surpass him with any amount of training? I'd say that's kind of weird. I would also say it's pretty weird because Hiruzen and others openly consider Minato to be greater than Hiruzen, both as an old man during Konoha Crush and in a more prime state during the Nine-Tails attack. This same Hiruzen, as an old man, is stated to be the strongest of the 5 Kage, a statement that I believe he backs up when he's brought back as an Edo. And what's interesting about this as well is that during the Nine-Tails attack, Hiruzen believes that he himself can restrain Kurama, or at least keep him contained long enough for Minato to come help, which again supports the lines of scaling that we have presented already. So to conclude this point, using that databook statement in reference to Hokage Minato would require extra context to prove that it's not in reference to Jonin Minato, as the Yellow Flash nickname is mostly used to describe him in his Jonin state. Then when you add in the fact that Hokage Minato consistently scales above characters who are significantly above A, it becomes even more clear that this is the most consistent line of scaling. The final point that I'd like to make in terms of where Hokage Minato scales is in regards to another statement made by Kurama. You see, Minato tells Naruto that he needs to master the Nine-Tails power in order to beat the Masked Man, and Kurama, hundreds of chapters later, says this is what the 4th wanted in regards to Naruto using KCM2. This confirms that KCM2 is the power that Minato was referring to when he said he needed to achieve this power to beat the Masked Man. And this is important because he never makes these statements for KCM1 or Mastered KCM, aka KCM 1.5. So it wasn't until he achieved KCM2 that Kurama acknowledges that he's reached the goal Minato set for him. Since that statement was never made at KCM 1 or 1.5, this is a great indication that Hokage Minato should be above that KCM 1.5 level of power if it wasn't enough to bring down the Masked Man, and Minato was able to do that himself. So Minato being somewhere between KCM 1.5 Naruto and KCM 2 Naruto actually makes a lot of sense. Not only do we have solid scaling getting a weaker version of Minato above KCM 1 Naruto, we also have this statement from Kurama happening when it does, and a statement from Kakashi hallucinating KCM 2 Naruto as Minato when Naruto blitzes and knocks away these Bijudamas that were heading for him. So in my opinion, I think Kakashi, being an absolute genius, would have to believe that Minato was capable of doing something similar in order to truly hallucinate that it's Minato standing there. I also feel like Kishimoto does stuff like this on purpose, and it's always dangerous to interpret author's intent, but if his intent was not to kind of imply that he's at this Hokage Minato level, this feels like a totally pointless scene in my opinion. But even without that, having Minato at this level is both consistent for the scaling for his weaker versions and non-contradictory for the narrative moments and statements that we get during the war. Well, that is the video. I was going to go over KCM Minato, but I would like to establish his scaling in a separate video since there are a lot of interesting matchups you can put him in that form, but I hope that I was able to establish a solid baseline for where he realistically should scale and debunk some of the more disingenuous scaling chains that I've seen. So if you've enjoyed the video or learned anything, make sure that you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out when new content drops. And speaking of new content, next week I'll be dropping a video over how strong Anbu Itachi is, and then continuing that the following week with a special Anbu Kakashi and Anbu Itachi video that I think you guys are going to love. So make sure to tune in for those. But for those of you who made it this far, thank you for making it all the way to the end. I genuinely greatly appreciate it. And until next time, have an awesome day.